Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Boosting Productivity of Frontline Workers with Modern Mobility. First, some notes. Everyone is on mute today. The presentation is being recorded, so a replay link and a copy of the slides will be emailed after the webinar. The webinar is hosted today by Brett Cooper and Lee DeHines. Lee is a director at Bluefletch and has been in technology and mobility for nearly 2 decades, with a wealth of experience in program development, strategy formulation, and data-driven analysis. Brett is a founding partner of Bluefletch and also has been in the tech and mobility industry for over 20 years with companies like Coca-Cola and Accenture. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Brett and Lee.
Today I'm joined by Lee DeHines, who's head of RevOps here at Bluefletch, and we're going to be talking about a research report we've done with VDC, which is a analyst group. I think they're out of Boston or somewhere in the Northeast, but they're pretty strong in what I would call the AIDC space. And the AIDC is rugged devices or mobile devices for frontline workers. We engage with them specifically to learn more about current use cases for mobile devices in the enterprise or frontline worker space, and then also the future use cases. And I guess, Lee, from your experience, maybe you could talk a bit about, we start out with what are the areas that you work on within Bluefletch? What are the things you've been focused on the most?
Sure. So when I talk to customers, it's typically at the top of our process in terms of them investigating our product. And I'd say the industries that I talk to the most are retail, warehouse, manufacturing, transportation and logistics, and then some hospitality. So really more just playing in the space where the frontline worker lives.
Why do people, so you mentioned people reach out to us, like what are the things that when you get inbounds to you, what are they looking for? What are the things people are looking for help with?
The initial one, I'd say by far and away, is single sign-on, meaning they're looking for a solution that will allow their employees to pick up a device, enter their credentials, and be able to see all the applications that are appropriate for their job. And then a fast follower to that, I would say, is device security. And what that means is knowing where a device is at a given time, knowing what applications are being used on it, knowing who is using it, really just to see where it is, if it's lost, if it's being used, that sort of thing. So security is kind of a bigger word, almost like device integrity or something like that.
Got it. So on my Samsung device or my iOS device, it'll save my passwords and do that as long as I log on my face. How is that different for frontline worker devices?
So frontline worker devices, more and more, are shared devices. So what that means is, let's say you're operating a manufacturing facility where you're going 24/7, so you're probably running 3 shifts. A user is going to come in at the beginning of his or her shift, pick a device up off of a cradle, log into it, and at the end of their shift, once they're done, put it back on a cradle. So all of that information needs to be wiped off of that device before the next person picks it up. So from a security perspective, that's really the main difference, is the shared device side of it. So you don't want to be saving passwords on the device. You don't want to have a session persist from when I'm using it to when you're using it, especially if your job's different than mine. I don't want to see something that's application data that may not be appropriate for my role, or just would be confusing for me to see if it's a different job.
Got it. And it sounds like you're pretty familiar with the use cases already. Why did we reach out to an analyst to help do this research? What was the actual purpose of us trying to gather more intel or insight around the space?
Sure. So I'm familiar with it in the extent of the people that I talk to seem to have similar concerns. But what we don't know is the people that we don't talk to, what their concerns are. So we were looking at it from the perspective of avoiding confirmation bias, just trying to understand what else might be out there besides what we hear on a day-to-day basis from the people that we speak with, just to avoid being stuck in a kind of a rut.
Got it. And you talked a little bit about the frontline worker. What does that space look like? Is that 500 million workers? And what are the typical jobs that we see across companies for frontline workers?
Sure. So frontline workers are a huge part of just the global workforce. Globally, it's estimated to be at 1.8 billion workers. And the way frontline worker is defined is typically anyone performing what's deemed to be a critical task to a business. So that could be actually talking to a customer, like in a retail environment, manufacturing something, like actually putting something together or making something, picking something up off a shelf, packing, completing an order, or even delivering something to your front door, like a UPS or Amazon driver or something like that. So actually fulfilling a task is really how we define frontline worker.
Yeah, and then you said 1.8 billion.
1.8 billion.
Would it be? That's a lot of people. And so an example would be like in a company like Amazon, the guys in the warehouse, the guys driving the trucks, the people manufacturing the products, but not the people in the office typing code or telling people
Exactly.
where to go.
Yeah. So those people typically don't have shared devices. What we call, I guess, in the industry, like the carpet jobs, meaning they're working in an office as opposed to a factory or out on the street. Typically, that's not the environment that we're dealing with, and not who our customers are calling us to ask about solutions for.
Got it. And on these frontline worker devices, what are the applications? What does the application stack look like? What do we see as we go work with these companies? What are the things that are on there?
Sure. So because this is a large investment and some of these fleets of devices run into the tens of thousands, there's kind of three levels of applications. There's the device management level, like an MDM or an EMM. There's the identity management system that's on that device, so that my username and password or your username and password is somehow federated to that device and to the applications on that device. And then finally, the application devices themselves, what we call LOB or line of business devices. And then from there, those are further divided out into things like comms, like a messaging platform, performance of task, like knowing what item to pick next, a workflow management type thing, training and compliance, also HR from even like clocking in, clocking out, scheduling, that kind of thing. So really just anything that you can think of that is tactically functional to getting your job done on a day-to-day basis.
Got it. And the key difference we've seen increase in the last couple of years, and I think the report and research showed this too with all the companies they talked to, is that it used to be a single app. It'd be like a green screen app that you'd log into, tie into the WMS or the EMR or whatever it is, do your functionality, and that was it. Now we're seeing all these different apps on there. Like how big is the app footprint on these shared devices? Or what did the research show around that?
Sure. So the research showed that I think going from 2018 to present day, average application device on each mobile handheld went from 2.9 to 5.4. So that's like an 86% increase. Anecdotally, that still seems like a low number to me, at least from the folks that we're talking to. It seems to be a much higher application number than that. In some cases, we've had people with more than 36 applications on a device. So it can get pretty complex in terms of the amount of tasks that a frontline worker is performing throughout his or her shift.
So effectively, a mobile device has replaced or has become a computer or laptop
definitely.
For the people on the front line.
Yeah, and we've had certain customers of ours, particularly in the retail space, that have removed desktops entirely from their environment and are relying entirely on handhelds, sometimes with like an external monitor plugged in. But yeah, it's definitely replaced what a computer would do in the past.
Got it. And from that hardware landscape, what does the hardware look like? I know a while back it was like Windows CE. What is the mix of iOS, Windows, and Android in the frontline worker space?
So these days, I would say Windows is all but disappeared. I think this year I've talked to one customer that still had Windows devices that they were trying to replace. So it's almost exclusively Android, at least in the frontline worker space. It does tend to change up a little bit when we go back to those office jobs. Those are more iOS driven because, again, those are not shared devices. But in a shared device landscape, it's almost exclusively Android these days. And we see people going to that. We still see some iOS going to Android, but I've only talked to one Windows customer this year.
And then I guess in your experience or from the report, was there any discerning tablets versus the handheld like form factor, I would call it the 3 to 5 inch or 3 to 6 inch form factor versus the 8 to 12 inch?
I wouldn't say from a research perspective that there's a trend of one necessarily going more prevalent than the other. It's really more job specific. So an example would be something that's mounted on a forklift. Tablet is probably going to be the form factor that you would see for that. Whereas if I'm walking around and talking to customers doing more mobile point of sale or cycle count or something like that, it's probably going to be a tablet. A handheld.
You're like the old lady at my kid's school performance that brings the tablet to film the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Usually with the cover hanging down.
That's hilarious. One of the things that stood out in the report that you and I talked about was, I think you called it like the friction between operations and InfoSec. Can you dive into that topic a bit or talk about what stood out there to you?
Sure. So in the report, and there was a lot more discussion in that report than I expected, frankly, to see around what operations is trying to do, meaning put a device in the hands of a frontline worker so he or she can perform their job, and then what InfoSec views as an inherent risk of having the ability to do single sign-on, adding more applications, so adding more hardware, adding more software to what InfoSec needs to be managing. So typically we deal with the operations side of things, at least during our initial calls, and our interaction with information security is usually around filling out questionnaires and things like that and sending documentation to them. But learning how much of a friction actually exists was something that was a little bit of a surprise to me in the report. And I think the takeaway from that was, from our perspective, is getting information security involved sooner in the process, because they do have questions. And as a rule, information security is pretty stretched in terms of resources and budget. So the more software and hardware they have to manage, the harder it's going to be for them to get their job done.
Yeah, so engage with InfoSec early and make them part of the process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is, I didn't read this in the report, but this is just more anecdotally, we've had companies that have come to us because they had a operations team put a certain application that caused a breach on devices, and that's, it's a big no-no, because you want to have those processes, but I think the balance is information security would tell you put nothing on there, but you need to have the processes and the agreements in place, and all of that just comes from having those people involved and having the teams work together up front. So it is really important. Turning a blind eye is not a good strategy from a security standpoint.
No, because I think if you get so far down the path and then you bring in information security, their reaction is going to be, there are way too many decisions made that expose risks that we should have known about 6 months ago. And then at that point, their knee jerk is going to just shut it down. So getting them involved early is definitely the way to go.
Yeah. And speaking of just blind spots, can you talk a bit about, in the report itself, was there anything that stood out to you around areas where companies are underinvesting, in addition to the before mentioned security pieces?
Yeah, I think usability is really the big thing right now in terms of where companies could be spending more time and effort. Because so many of us interact with mobile devices outside of work and are on them 3 hours a day during our day-to-day lives, making that device, when a user comes in the door at work, look and feel and act just like something they may see in their day-to-day lives is that much more important. And so having a thing like the launcher that we provide that lives on that device, that looks and feels like something they might see on their personal device, where they can log in once and all their applications are there, is a huge benefit. If you think about it, when you pick up your device at home and you want to look at your recipe app, and then you want to look at social media, and then you want to look at news, you're not logging into each of those things. And so that's the experience that a user is accustomed to. And porting that over into the workplace, I think, is really where an investment could be made.
I guess in the app side itself, are there certain things that companies should do, outside just the launcher, things we do? Are there other areas, like for your app teams, what they should be doing from a UX standpoint that you've seen on the app dev side?
Yeah, I think, again, just focusing on the usability side of things in terms of making it clear what the next step should be. If it's like a process in warehouse management where this was step one and this is step two, so they need to know what happens next, as opposed to making it something where they have to jump around from screen to screen and just taking something that was once on a desktop and just shrinking it. I think that is going away, or has to go away, if you want to continue to make these devices sticky and make the application sticky.
That's a good call. I think from a support standpoint, the number I think from the report stood out to me. There was a huge support cost associated with these devices. When we say support, what does that involve? I'm assuming it's like setup, it's the help desk calls, it's people can't figure out an application. What does that look like on these mobile devices? Yeah,
so I think in the report it said the average support call was 44 minutes. And average cost per device is $770. So if you have a fleet of, say, 10,000, 12,000 devices, that's $10 million a year in just help desk calls and helping people sign on to applications. So that's an enormous waste of effort.
It's almost as much as the hardware itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so I think investing in usability and making things intuitive on those devices, especially given the transient nature of frontline workers, if you have a turnover of 140% in a retail environment year over year, you're going to want to make sure that what is on that device is usable when the user picks it up, and they aren't going to have to get on the phone for 45 minutes a day.
Yeah. No more green screens.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in summary, if you had to go through the research report and boil it down, what would be like the one key takeaway you would want people to get out of this as they read it?
Yeah, I think when you look at it, it's a given that mobile devices are here to stay in the frontline worker space, but there needs to be more thought around the holistic investment that goes along with that, meaning the infrastructure to support it. So that means making sure that your MDM tooling and deployments are set up correctly, making sure that your applications are easy to sign into, making sure that once you're in those applications, they're easy to use and easy to support. Because if you just buy the devices and then hand them out without a lot of thought around it, you're going to go back up and spend that $10 million a year on support. And if you do things right up front and put the infrastructure in place, you're going to be able to get a return on that investment.
Yeah, I always say start with the worker in mind.
Absolutely.
The other way around. Too many companies start with like thinking about all the bells and whistles as opposed to how do you make this person's job better day to day. To somebody, they're not easy jobs. Like driving a truck is, I've done it before. It's not easy. Or be working at a restaurant where you got people yelling at you all day. It's not a simple job, but how do you make their job a little bit better and easier and make them happier? Helps. That turnover and retention definitely helps, and also just like the overall just performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the mindset is just, if we buy this device, the device is cool and will make the job better. But I think you really have to go and, if you're considering an investment like this, go and actually spend time with the frontline workers, shadowing them, and look at how the device can improve their lives and their performance and overall happiness. And I think if you approach it from that perspective, you're going to be much more successful.
All right, so this section of the webinar, we're going to read a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, Lee, I'll let you go first in this one, but how much time or resources are really saved with SSO? And I'm guessing your answer is going to be it depends, but go ahead. What's your thought on this one?
Yeah, sure. So for sure, it depends. But we have done some studies on this, just looking at it from the perspective of if you have 10 plus applications on a device that your users are using throughout the course of their day. And that number is becoming more and more prevalent. 10, I think a few years ago, was an outsized number to see on a device, but now we have some customers that have several dozen. So if you're looking at 30 seconds or so to log in during the course of an 8-hour shift, your users over the course of a year may be spending upwards of 60 hours a year, essentially logging in. And if that means you're paying your associates an average of $12 an hour, which may even be a little low, that's, we're looking at over $700 a year per associate just in logging in. So if you multiply that times, in some cases, tens of thousands of associates, it can add up really quickly.
Yeah, I think that's just the base cost savings you're going to get from SSO, which is the time on the floor. There's two other things I always think of. One is that associated employee, if they're servicing a customer or performing tasks, let's say in a warehouse, that's time when they're not performing those tasks. So it's not just the time you're paying them to do that, but that's time that's taken away from something else that's actually more valuable. And then the other thing that comes to mind is the password reset conundrum of, I think that I can't remember the current number. I think it's between $70 and $90 per password reset call. Every time your employees type in their password, there's a risk of them fat fingering. Every time they fat finger multiple times, it gets locked and they have to call the help desk. So they're off the floor dealing with the help desk, and the help desk guys are dealing with it. And that ends up costing, I think, $70 per help desk call. So there's a lot of hidden second order costs associated with it. But I think your number, which is just the raw number of how many hours a year you're going to save, is going to be $700+ is what we've seen average in our customers on the low end and the high end. I think you mentioned one customer, but I think we had a customer that had 60 or 70 apps. This being said, not all their employees are using those apps, but it's definitely, there's a lot of cost savings that can happen during a work shift. So the The next question that came in was, is there a way to lock devices if they leave a warehouse area? And I think this is a question we get a lot around like geofencing and securing devices. So I guess, Lee, what have you seen around this with our solution or with other solutions that are out there?
Sure. So I think you hit on one from a geofencing perspective, which is definitely one way to lock down a device if it's outside certain parameters that you set. Another way to do it is to designate networks against which that device is allowed to actually access authentication. So if a device leaves a known set of networks, then it can no longer actually authenticate and therefore essentially becomes a useless or bricked device. So what you would see in that case, if you left that series of known networks, what you would have on the device would be something like what we call luggage tag mode, which essentially gives you information on who the device belongs to from an organizational perspective, how to return that device with like an email address and phone number, but then essentially rendering the device useless unless you're on one of those known networks.
Yeah, the network one is to me feels a little bit more effective because with geofencing, you always run the risk of a device has the location awareness turned off or doesn't have that. But if it's not connected to the network, you just put it in what you call a luggage mode, and you can do I think whether it's our tool or whether it's MDMs, there's definitely options for a lot of the geofencing or network awareness. It's a good way to handle that, locking that. The next question that
Yeah,
came in was, can a worker on a shared device share passwords or be logged into more than one device? I feel like that's actually two questions, but I'll let you, maybe you can field the first part is can they share passwords, and the second part is can they be logged in more than one device?
sure. So from a shared password perspective, the idea with how you would typically um, configure this would be from the perspective of each user would have their own set of unique credentials that would access applications that are appropriate for their particular role. You definitely could have multiple users all accessing the same application, but the idea is that their session on that device is tied to their credentials. So you don't run into circumstances with data from a previous shift or a previous session, or in places like California or the EU where privacy laws definitely prevail. You're going to want to make sure that you're actually clearing out user data so you don't run into a situation where there's privacy concerns. So typically, shared passwords is not something that we would recommend. I think there are some shared pins depending on manufacturing settings that are universal, but there are ways to manage that at a systemic level as well.
Yeah, and I think we advocate very strongly if you have using an IDP or identity provider to have each user have their own individual account. And then with a lot of those IDPs, you can even have what's called 2FA or two-factor authentication. And that it requires a user to use a token or their phone or something else. And that helps diminish the amount of password sharing you're going to get where people aren't sharing accounts. Yeah, and I think the one switch we have where if you log into one device, it kicks you out of the other one is definitely useful. We see that used in a lot of our clients.
Yeah, and
The
I think if there's a concern about people remembering a password for a particular application, then the impetus would be towards giving everyone the same password. You can avoid that with things like NFC badge tap and um, a PIN. So you have the classic what you have and what you know, and you can avoid, again, the pitfall of having shared usernames and passwords across multiple users.
Yeah, I have seen one scenario here though, which is shared accounts for a store. So the example would be, or location would be like a ServiceNow account where, store 101 has a support account. And what we've seen there a lot of times is you can have those accounts grouped and linked to all the users who are at that site. And then we've also for some of our customers have used our password manager for having those. And it's similar to what you'll have with LastPass and OneLogin, where you can have 10 users that all have to log in with their credentials and then have access to that one credential that is shared. But in general, I think our guidance is where possible, try to have either groups or individual user accounts. Don't try to ever have shared user accounts.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next question that came in is, do you need GPS to locate devices that go missing?
And I think, we touched on this aspect in one of the previous questions around locking devices down. So the answer to that would be no, you don't need GPS. And, in certain situations, we've run into customers that actually don't want location services turned on. So really what you can look at is the most recent network or the most recent access point in a facility against which that device last pinged. And for example, with Wi-Fi 6, you can actually get down to within about a meter of that device based simply on network configurations as opposed to having GPS enabled on that device.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a cool underpinning of Android. So Android past Android 9 added in a lot of cool features around location services. So there's really what I consider three tiers of location services. The top tier is going to be GPS, actually using satellites and using a GPS antenna on a device. And a lot of the devices that are out on trucks are, yeah, it's really easy for them to do that. And then the second tier is going to be based on networks, like what Lee mentions. You're going to be able to use network trilateration, know what network you're on, and use APs to actually build a picture of location. And the third tier is sort of it's more complex, but it's like inferred location, and a lot of that uses things like magnometers and a lot of complex math that allows a device to get some semblance of locationing. And then one other thing that certain manufacturers, I know Zebra has a pretty cool feature they added around their batteries, and I know Honeywell has this too, where they have batteries that have beacons in them, so you can use beacons to actually understand where the device is in context near you. Even if the device is turned off, you can use those beacons. So that's another cool way to find devices that does not require GPS.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. The next question that came in, this is a bit of a broad question, but what types of applications work with SSO?
Yeah, and I guess the going back to the first question you asked is it depends, but really there's a couple different ways you can handle that. I think maybe the most straightforward one would be any application that is federated within your existing IDP. And then outside of that, there are other ways our tools, for example, use the password manager that Brett referred to a moment ago from the perspective of if you want to do authentication in a browser like a Chrome custom tab and then pass that through to the application, you can do it from that perspective. There's opportunities to have applications that are either native to the device that you purchase off the shelf, native to the device that you create internally with your own resources, or browser-based applications. It's really just a matter of configuration. And I know, for example, with our tool set, if you have a native app that you created internally, there are SDKs that we can give you to be integrated into that application so that you can actually federate it against your existing IDP.
Yep, I have no more to add there without spending an hour describing federation and an SSO and OAuth. So we'll hop to the next question, which is, can different permissions or apps be presented on shared devices? Or maybe how do you handle different applications and permissions for shared devices?
So I think the way I interpret this question is maybe a role-based scenario. So certain applications can be presented only to certain users based on their credentials they enter. So for example, if I have a specific set of tasks because I'm only doing picks for Vocus orders, I may see a different set of applications than if I'm someone who is doing cycle counts or doing mobile point of sale. Another thing that you can do is, we touched on it earlier from a known network perspective, depending on what location you're in, like if you are a driver, for example, going from one store to the next, depending on which store you are located, that list of known networks at a given store may present you with a different series of tasks or a different series of applications based on the networks that are there. And there are also different permissions you could set up based on task specific things. So for example, if you're presented with a search field that would say scan or type to search, you can actually scan a barcode, and depending on the barcode type, actually have a specific application open up to a specific set of tasks within that application based on some of those configurations that you do. So that's one way to answer that question. Brad, I don't know if you had other thoughts on how you might answer that question as well.
Yeah, so I was thinking through, I know our solution has a lot of features, capabilities around the role-based, you having different features and functionality based on your role or the user or the site. I know there's some with Microsoft's shared device mode, they don't necessarily have anything around role-based. So if you're using Intune, it doesn't have that capability right now. So I've seen some companies that'll actually bake that into the application. So they'll still show all the applications, but if you click on an application based on your role, when it does its SSO, it may not allow you to actually open the app. It's not as clean as what we do, but that's another option out there. I've seen a lot of companies do that are using a different solution than we provide.
Okay.
So the next question, which I'm sure you'll have a snarky answer to this, but probably could have been worded a little bit better. What can be done with stolen devices? Go ahead, Lee.
I'm going to avoid the snarky answer, but go straight to, from the perspective of if I'm the device owner, like an organization, and I'm concerned about my devices being stolen or resold or something like that. I think the way to look at it is really taking the value proposition away from the prospective thief, from the point of view of if this device leaves, like we talked about, maybe a geofenced area or a set of known networks, or something along those lines, that device effectively is completely locked down and not usable. So from the perspective of if I walk out of a known set of networks with a device, put it in my car, drive home, turn it back on to show someone how great the device is in order to sell it to them for, pennies on the dollar, I'm not going to be able to do anything with it other than show them that that device is owned by my employer, and that I can call my employer to return the device, or I can log into the device once I return to a known network. So I think from that perspective, ideally, nothing can be done with a stolen device is maybe the short way of answering that question is just ideally nothing. So there's ways that we try to lock that down with some of our tooling to make sure that really there's no reason that someone would want to steal some of these devices. And I know some are not that attractive necessarily to steal, like a scanner with a pistol grip and a tiny keyboard, but some of the more consumer friendly devices, or some of the nicer, more mirroring consumer friendly devices that are out there, definitely are things that people look at and like to take and run with. I know there's a large retailer out there that issued consumer grade devices to their employees, and it's been a little bit of a mess because people really do love the devices, which is great, but they take them home, put stickers on them, give them to their parents, hang charms off of them, things like that. So we're really trying to avoid any sort of temptation to do that kind of thing.
I mean, last I looked on eBay, I only saw about 600 of those devices for sale.
Yeah, I mean they're out there if you know how to find them.
They're definitely out there. I guess there's, to add a little more color to that, I think there's sort of three tiers I think about, which is the first tier is what Lee said, is the ability, if a device leaves your network, it goes into a locked mode or luggage tag mode, which, you could turn off, at certain manufacturers, you can turn off the ability to reset it without being if it's not connected to the MDMs, that prevents a reset or wipe. The second thing we've seen is actually forcing a reset or wipe. So if a device goes off your network and is not on your network for a period of time, and we have certain features we built that we call it a luggage mode wipe, but it's effectively if your device is not phone home for 30 days, like wipe everything off of it. So you don't have any of your Wi-Fi keys or APKs on there that somebody can rip off and try to decompile. And then I think the third thing that is, it's more recent, but Google released what's called ZTE, or zero touch enrollment. And if a device gets reset and gets back on a network, it'll re-enroll into the MDM that Google has it assigned to. It's not without faults, but it is another way that if somebody tries to reset your device and reuse it for something else, as soon as it gets on a network, it'll re-enroll and be locked into the original settings you had. So those are some other just additional ways that I think are useful there. So I think that's all the questions we've got so far. And if you have other questions, feel free to email or follow up with us at info@bluefletch.com, and appreciate everybody's time on the webinar today. If you're interested in reading the full report, check it out at the bluefletch.com website. You can search for VDC reports, or you can grab it in the show notes or link below. And if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us. Email us at info@bluefletch.com. Thank you and have a good one.
Thanks.
Thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com or on our website below. Have a great rest of your day.